we're going to consider if we can believe the gospel accounts of Jesus' resurrection. So what we're going to do is to look at the four gospel records of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John themselves to see if they are a credible witness of the events they claim occurred. I'm just going to concentrate on what they have to say. There are other secular evidences from the 1st and 2nd centuries that a man called Jesus existed and that his followers believed that he had risen from the dead. Now, those have been dealt with in the Gospel Online series in the past, and you can find a talk that covers that material on the link on the screen. So can we rely on the gospel records themselves to give a true picture of what happened to this Jesus that secular history tells us existed? Now, as a Bible believer, I believe that the gospel writers were caused by God to write down the records that bear their names. And that's under a process called inspiration. However, even if you don't believe that, you just take these as human-derived writings, can they still be relied on? Now, there is good evidence that the four Gospels that we find in the Bible were written in the mid-1st century AD, and certainly before AD 70, the date when Jerusalem was destroyed by the Roman armies. Again, I'm not going to go into those evidences now. And again, once more, you can find a talk that covers that material on the link I've just put up. Now, if that is the case, we find that the Gospels, therefore, were written at the latest between 25 and 40 years after the events that they claim to record. And quite probably considerably earlier. And that's important. It's like a history of the Second World War being written between 1970 and 1985. The fact is that there would have been many people alive who could have either corroborated or disproved what was being recorded. So there was an incentive for these writers to provide an accurate account of what happened. And another significant point to note is that the four writers all record different details and aspects of the events that occurred. They were clearly written independently of each other, and yet they can actually be placed together to make sense of the whole. But there are some key elements that they all agree on, and possibly the most important one is that there was an empty tomb. Regardless of your viewpoint as to whether a miracle such as the resurrection of Jesus really happened, the fact of there being an empty tomb is clear. This is what each of the gospel records says about this fact. So in Matthew 28, verses 5 to 6, it says there that the angel answered and said, "He's not here, for he is risen, as he said. Come, see the place where the Lord lay." In Mark chapter 16, verses 5 to 6, it says there, "And entering into the sepulchre, they saw a young man, and he said to them, 'Be not afraid. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, which was crucified. He's risen. He's not here. Behold the place where they laid him.'" And again in Luke, it says in Luke 24, verse 3, "And they," that's the women, "found the stone rolled away from the sepulchre, and they entered in and found not the body of the Lord Jesus." And then finally, in John's record, in John 20, verses 2, and then through to verses 6 and 7, "Then said Mary Magdalene to them," that's Simon Peter and another disciple, "that they have taken away the Lord out of the sepulchre, and we know not where they have laid him." And then came Simon Peter following him, and he went into the sepulchre and saw the linen clothes lie and the napkin that was about his head. And there was no body. So although the individuals at the time didn't necessarily understand what had happened, and even though some of the finer detail there recorded in each of the different accounts is slightly different, it is consistent that all of the gospel records record that there was an empty tomb. And so that's a positive thing that we can take on trust from these records. What then really matters then is what is the most likely explanation for why that tomb was empty. Now, Matthew's record actually provides one of the alternative suggestions that was going around at the time. It's recorded that the temple authorities had set a guard over the tomb. And so this is what Matthew records about that guard. It's in Matthew 28, verses 11 to 15. It says there, now when they were going, behold, some of the watch came into the city and showed unto the chief priests all the things that were done. And when they were assembled with the elders and had taken counsel, and they gave large money unto the soldiers, saying, say ye, his disciples came by night and stole him away while we slept. And if this comes to the governor's ears, we will persuade him and secure you. So they took the money, did as they were taught, and this saying is commonly reported among the Jews until this day. Now, whether or not then you believe the account of the resurrection, what this shows is that there was definitely an empty tomb. Now, Matthew himself clearly didn't believe in this tale that the temple guard had fallen asleep and the disciples had stolen the body, but he reported it all the same in that gospel record. And in reporting this, he almost incidentally notes that the Jewish authorities also confirmed that there was an empty tomb. They had to give this story as an explanation of it. It was an undeniable fact at that time. And as an aside, that also adds to the evidence that Matthew was written well before AD 70. He notes that the Jews were reporting that saying to this day, indicating in his writing then that the Jewish authorities were still in a place of authority at the time that he wrote. It would also be the case that if what he was saying wasn't true, it could immediately be challenged and disproved by his readers. So all we have is these words which have a ring of truth about them. Even if you don't actually believe the resurrection element of it at this stage, there was clearly a report going round by the Jews that there was an empty tomb, and they had to find an explanation of it, for it. Why would Matthew make mention of it otherwise if it wasn't the case, particularly as he didn't believe the report himself, other than he was just giving a factual account of what was being said by the Jewish authorities? And so that then raises the question, well, was this explanation that the Jews gave for the empty tomb a reasonable one? Now, to answer that, we have to look at the motivation for the first disciples of Jesus. What would they have had for spreading that gospel message about his resurrection in the first century? It's well recorded by Roman historians that Christians were a persecuted group in that first century and that they preached this Jesus. And it's clear if you just take the commentary part of the Acts record as being a historical basis, they were also persecuted and harassed by the Jewish authorities. So if the rumor being spread by these Jewish rulers was true, that the disciples had stolen the body, well, the disciples would have known that what they were preaching was false. And so it's a fair question to ask, well, why would they risk the troubles, the persecutions that they faced, if they knew that what they were saying was completely untrue? It was based on a lie. And this is where that ring of truth comes into play again. When you consider what the disciples went through and their absolute lack of any financial status reward in this world, which of those two stories stacks up? A stolen body or an eyewitness of a resurrected Jesus? Why would they have preached this otherwise? There are also other instances in the resurrection narrative that the gospel writers pick up on, which again have this ring of truth about them. One worth highlighting is that in contrast to their later zeal in preaching about Jesus' resurrection, in the immediate aftermath of Jesus' crucifixion, the records present the disciples as not believing that the resurrection had occurred, and it records them of being berated for their lack of belief and that they were fearful of what was happening. This is what it says in Matthew 28, verses 16 to 17. It says there, "Then the 11 disciples went away into Galilee, into a mountain which Jesus had appointed them. And when they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted." In Mark 16, verse 11 and verse 14, it says there, "And they," that's the disciples, "when they heard that he was alive and had been seen of her," that's Mary Magdalene, "believed not. Afterward, he appeared unto the 11 as they sat at meat, and he upbraided them with their unbelief and hardness of heart, because they believed not them which had seen him after he was risen." In Luke 24, verse 11, it says this, and there, that's the women's words, "seemed to them as idle tales, and they believed them not." And then in John 20, verse 19, we have the disciples hiding, even though they had been told that he had been risen that day. And it says there that then the same day at evening, being the first day of the week, when the doors were shut, where the disciples were assembled for fear of the Jews, shows there that they were scared. And what then follows is Jesus then appearing to them, needing to show them his injuries before they would believe that he really had risen from the dead. And it goes on then to record how Thomas, one of the disciples, wasn't there, and he refused to believe for the whole of that next week that Jesus had indeed risen from the dead, until Jesus appeared to him as well. So again, not only are the four gospel records consistent, they are consistent in highlighting this failure of the disciples to believe that Jesus was risen from the dead. Details are slightly different in each one that are recorded, but they all show them in quite a bad light, really. Not usually the type of narrative that someone would write about either themselves or the leaders of their organization that would go ahead. So again, it has that ring of truth about it. This is a narrative that can be trusted. So we're left with the fact of an empty tomb. And if it wasn't because Jesus had been risen from the dead, what was the reason for it? We've already had a think about the suggestion that the disciples stole the body away. Now, there have been other alternative explanations that have been offered throughout the years, and some find popularity in various other belief sections. And now some of the most common, I'll put them on the screen here. So if instead of the disciples stealing the body away, it was either Jewish or Roman authorities that had taken the body, the question then, if that was the reason for the empty tomb, well, why didn't they just produce the body and quash once for all the rumours that had been going around, and this troubling group that was growing rapidly and causing them problems would be done away with immediately? The suggestion that the second one down there, that Jesus fainted on the cross or was assumed dead and then revived in the tomb and he wasn't actually dead, bases its argument on the fact that usually crucifixions could last for days before the individual would die, and that is true. But the thought that could have happened doesn't take into account the realities of the process of crucifixion. The hammering of a nail through the feet or the ankles of a victim alone would have rendered him lame. And there is no chance that someone could just have rolled away a stone from a tomb and simply walk out from it a few days later, having been through that process of crucifixion. It just would not have happened. And then there's a suggestion that the women, those who were the first witnesses of the resurrection, were mistaken, and that they actually went to the wrong tomb. And it was an empty tomb because, well, it never had a body in it. But this belies the fact that the tomb was a well-known one. It belonged to a high-ranking official of the day. And again, that evidence would have been clear and apparent. The likelihood that this tomb was wrongly identified, again, just doesn't hold up. And actually, the fact that it was the witness of women that was originally relied on to convey the message that Jesus had risen from the dead is another message which has that ring of truth about it. See, all four gospel records are in agreement again that it was the women who were indeed the first witnesses of the resurrection. Matthew 28, verse 8 says, and they, that's Mary Magdalene and the other Mary, if you look at verse 1, departed quickly from the sepulchre with fear and joy, and did run to bring his disciples word. Mark records in chapter 16, verse 10, and she, that's Mary Magdalene again from verse 9, went and told them that he had been, that had been with him as they mourned and wept. So she went and told those disciples. Luke notes in chapter 24, verse 10, that it was Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary, the mother of James, and other women that were with them, which told these things unto the apostles. And finally, John chapter 20, verse 18 says, Mary Magdalene came and told the disciples that she had seen the Lord and that he had spoken these things unto her. So once more, although there are different elements of the events being recorded in each of the Gospels, and these can be put together into a consistent narrative and timeline, there is a consistent thread running through them, that it was the witness of women that was first of all being relied on by God to pass on the message that Jesus had risen from the dead. Now, there's some discussion about the validity of the witness of women in the first century, but regardless of that, we see again there is a consistency which has that element of truth about it, even if it could possibly have been viewed in a negative light. So we've seen that we can have reason to believe the gospel accounts of Jesus' resurrection. Despite the differences in the narratives, they present a consistent message in respect of the events they record. They have that ring of truth about them. There was an empty tomb. Of that, there can be no doubt. And the Bible gives the most plausible explanation as to why that happened. Jesus was raised from the dead. His followers believed it, and they spread the message of it in the first century. Some were guided by God to write those details down for us to read almost 2,000 years later. And the Bible tells us that we need to be ready for when he, that's Jesus, is going to return and establish God's kingdom back on this earth. Thank you for joining this Gospel Online talk. Please keep a lookout for more posts in the Gospel Online series and subscribe or add comments in the notes below. Thanks for watching.